The winter of 1877 carved its presence into the Wyoming territory with merciless precision. Frost etched delicate patterns across the windows of Ethan Reed's homestead like nature's own glasswork, beautiful but unforgiving. The temperature had fallen to 10 below zero during the night, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice and made the boards of the porch contract with audible protests. Ethan stepped onto that porch at first light, steam rising from the coffee mug clutched in his weathered hand. He stood 6 feet tall, shoulders broad from years of labor, face weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of faded denim. At 38, his dark hair had begun to gray at the temples, each silver strand marking a year since he'd lost everything that mattered. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, turning the snow-covered hills to gold when Ethan's boot hit the first step and he froze. 3 huddled figures lay beneath a threadbare quilt on his porch, frost glittering around them like scattered diamonds. A woman and 2 children. He stood motionless, coffee cooling rapidly in the bitter air. 8 years. 8 years since strangers had crossed his threshold. 8 years of carefully constructed solitude shattered by the unexpected sight before him. The woman's eyes snapped open as if sensing his presence. They were amber brown, feral with exhaustion but defiant. She clutched the smaller child to her chest protectively, her hand moving instinctively to the shoulder of the boy beside her. "We won't trouble you long," she whispered, her voice rough as crows call. "Just till sunrise." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote from the ridge that bordered the eastern edge of Ethan's 160 acres. Land granted to him under the Homestead Act of 1862, where he'd built his 2-room cabin with his own hands, where he'd planned to raise a family, where he'd eventually buried his hopes alongside his wife. Ethan's jaw worked as he studied the trio. The woman's boots were worn through at the toes, her hands raw and cracked from cold and work. The boy, perhaps 8 years old, blinked up at him with wary blue eyes, pale face pinched with hunger. The little girl remained asleep against her mother's chest, her small face framed by blonde curls that reminded Ethan of, he could send them away. Should probably. A man alone didn't need complications. But something in the woman's eyes held him. Desperation, yes, but also that bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying the world too long without rest. He recognized it from his own reflection. "If they snore," he muttered finally, turning back toward the door, "I'll build a room." He left the door ajar, an invitation without words, and retreated inside to the warmth of his pot-bellied Monarch stove, purchased in 1871 when the hardware store had first opened in Oak Ridge, the nearest town some 20 miles distant. Behind him he heard the soft shuffle of boots as the woman hesitated, then the gentle creak of the porch boards as she gathered her children and approached the open door. Ethan stood at the stove, staring into his coffee. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold. The first strangers in his house since Mary died, since the baby died with her. What in God's name had he just done? The woman entered cautiously, carrying the little girl. The boy followed close behind, clutching a small wooden horse that had seen better days. Ethan didn't turn to face them. He couldn't. Instead, he moved to the cupboard and took down 4 plates. 4. He hadn't used 4 plates in nearly a decade. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the rough-hewn table that dominated the main room. The cabin was simple but solid. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a single bedroom behind a door to the right. A root cellar accessed through a trap door provided storage during winter months. A workshop adjacent to the barn housed his carpentry tools, evidence of the skill in every joint and board of the cabin itself. The children stared at the food like it might vanish. Bacon he'd smoked himself from last fall's slaughter, biscuits made from flour ground at the mill in Oak Ridge, coffee for the adults, and milk from his single cow for the children. The boy swallowed hard, eyes darting to his mother for permission. The woman nodded, and the children fell upon the food, devouring it with barely contained desperation. The woman ate more slowly, her gaze constantly moving between Ethan and the door, watchful as a hunted animal. Ethan focused on his plate, the sounds of chewing and silverware scraping, feeling loud as thunder in his quiet house. When the plates were empty, the woman stood without a word and began washing dishes. "You don't have to," Ethan started. "Yes, I do." Her voice was firm as she organized his chaotic counter with efficient movements. Ethan noticed her hands, rough, capable, the hands of someone who knew work and didn't shy from it. He shifted uncomfortably, unused to sharing his space. "Name's Rebecca," she said finally, her back still to him. Rebecca Morton, this is William. That's Charlotte. Ethan nodded, not yet offering his own name. My husband died 6 months ago, Rebecca continued, voice flat as she scrubbed a pan with more force than necessary. Mine collapsed near Silverton. Creditors took the house 2 weeks later. She paused, shoulders tense. We walked 3 days to get here. Why here? The question escaped before Ethan could stop himself. Rebecca turned, meeting his eyes directly. Man at the general store said you were decent. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, ornery but decent. Ethan almost smiled, almost. William's small voice broke the silence. You got horses, mister? Ethan looked at the boy, saw the hope there, fragile as spring ice. He nodded toward the barn, visible through the window. The boy's face lit up like sunrise. Can I see them? Rebecca interrupted. William, Mr. Reed, Ethan supplied. Ethan Reed. Mr. Reed has been kind enough to give us shelter. Don't impose further. Ethan felt something crack in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 8 years. Barn's got a loft, he heard himself say, the words seeming to come from somewhere outside himself. Warmer than the porch. You can sleep there till I figure things out. Rebecca's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't let them fall. Pride kept her spine straight. We'll earn our keep. I can cook, mend, work. Can you swing a hammer? Ethan asked. She blinked, confusion crossing her features. What? That room won't build itself. Rebecca stared at him, then slowly nodded once. Deal made. Ethan stood, grabbed his hat from its peg by the door. I'll inventory the timber. He walked out before she could see his hands shaking. In the barn, surrounded by the familiar smell of hay and leather, Ethan leaned against a post and closed his eyes. The chestnut mare nickered softly from her stall, the sound anchoring him to the present when memories threatened to drag him into the past. He just invited strangers to stay, to help him build something. What was he building? A room or something far more dangerous? He drew a deep breath of the cold air, letting it steady him. Then he walked to the small loft at the rear of the barn, assessing its suitability. It would need cleaning, fresh straw, blankets, but it would serve until what? What was he thinking? The sound of the barn door opening saved him from his thoughts. William stood framed in the doorway, eyes wide as he took in the interior. Your ma know you're here? Ethan asked. The boy nodded. She's helping Charlotte wash up. Ethan gestured to the nearest stall. That there's Sadie, 7 years old, good temperament. William approached the stall cautiously, eyes bright with wonder as the chestnut mare lowered her head in greeting. She's beautiful. You ride before? The boy shook his head. My pa didn't keep horses. Said they ate too much for what they gave back. Ethan noted the correction, the shadow that passed over the boy's face at the mention of his father. Horses are partners, Ethan said. Treat them fair, they'll do the same. William nodded solemnly, reaching out a tentative hand to stroke Sadie's velvety nose. Something settled in Ethan's chest watching the boy with the horse. He recognized the beginnings of a bond, remembered the first time his own father had introduced him to the magic of these animals. A legacy passed down. He cleared his throat. Come on, help me clean up that loft for you and your family. As they worked together, spreading fresh straw, Ethan found himself studying the boy. William worked without complaint, following instructions carefully. There was an eagerness to please that spoke of a child unused to male approval. Your pa, Ethan ventured carefully. He worked the mines long? William's movements faltered. 5 years, sir. Started after the war. The Civil War ended 12 years prior, but its shadow still stretched across the nation. Ethan had been fortunate, too young to fight, though he'd lost an older brother at Antietam. He drink? Ethan asked, keeping his tone neutral. William's silence was answer enough. Was he hard on you and your ma? The boy's hands stilled completely. Ma wouldn't want me talking about such things. Ethan nodded, respecting the loyalty. Fair enough. They continued working in silence until the loft was habitable. Ethan brought blankets from the cabin, thick wool ones he'd traded for last winter. As they descended the ladder, William clutching the wooden horse he'd set aside during their work, the boy paused. Mr. Reed? Thank you for not sending us away. The simple gratitude struck Ethan with unexpected force. You're welcome, son. The words slipped out unbidden, and Ethan turned away quickly, busying himself with Sadie's feed to hide his discomfort. When they returned to the cabin, Rebecca was at the stove, stirring something that smelled better than anything that had come from Ethan's cooking in years. Charlotte sat at the table, small legs swinging, a rag doll clutched in one arm. Her blonde curls were damp from washing, her face revealing delicate features that reminded Ethan painfully of Eleanor. Found some vegetables in your root cellar, Rebecca explained. Hope that's all right. Thought soup would stretch the meat further. Ethan nodded, hanging his hat. Loft's ready when you need it. Rebecca's eyes met his, gratitude and wariness mingling in their depths. Thank you. Ethan retreated to his workshop after eating, needing space to process the upheaval of his carefully ordered existence. The small building adjacent to the barn housed his woodworking tools, a sanctuary where he'd spent countless hours these past 8 years, losing himself in the grain of the wood, the precision of measurements, the clean lines of a well-crafted piece. He found himself standing before the doorframe he'd installed the previous spring, fingers tracing the carving there, Eleanor's baby James, 1869, his hand, his knife, his hope buried with them both. Eleanor had died in childbirth 8 years ago. The baby, a boy, never drew breath. Ethan had built this ranch as a fortress after that, a place where grief couldn't follow because there was nothing left to feel. But today, he'd heard a child's laughter for the first time in nearly a decade. Charlotte's giggle had pierced through the cabin window as he'd walked to the workshop, the sound like a key turning in a long rusted lock. Ethan measured boards by lantern light, assessing what materials he had on hand for the room he'd impulsively promised. The eastern wall of the cabin could be extended, creating a new space adjacent to his bedroom. He'd need more timber than he currently had, along with nails, hinges, window glass. A trip to Oak Ridge would be necessary. Ethan grimaced at the thought. He avoided town when possible, preferring his solitude to the curious stares and whispered conversations that fell silent as he approached. Oak Ridge had grown since he'd first staked his claim, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 bringing increased settlement to the territory. Though Wyoming was still 8 years away from statehood, through the small window, Ethan could see lights in the barn loft, new presences on his land, strangers. Yet already, the emptiness of his existence seemed thrown into stark relief by their arrival. Morning brought a clear sky and bitter cold. Ethan rose before dawn as always, building up the fire in the stove before heading to the barn for morning chores. He found William already there, awkwardly attempting to fill water troughs. Early riser, Ethan observed. Yes, sir. Thought I could help. Ethan showed him the proper way to break the ice that had formed overnight, explaining the importance of fresh water for the animals. William proved an attentive student, eyes serious as he absorbed every instruction. Your ma and sister still sleeping? William nodded. Charlotte was real tired from walking so long, and Ma... He hesitated. Ma doesn't sleep much usually. Reckon she needed it. Ethan's throat tightened at the implication. What had this family endured? When they returned to the cabin, Rebecca was at the stove, hair neatly braided, wearing the same worn dress, but with a clean apron Ethan recognized as one Eleanor had left behind. She turned at their entrance, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I found it in the trunk, she said quickly. I can take it off if... It's fine, Ethan cut her off, unable to bear her discomfort. Better it gets used than sits in darkness. Relief softened her features. Breakfast is nearly ready. Charlotte sat at the table, the same ragdoll clutched in her small hands. She looked up as they entered, blue eyes assessing Ethan with childish directness. Are you going to be our new pa? She asked. Rebecca dropped the spoon she was holding. Charlotte, that's not... Mr. Reed is kindly letting us stay for a while, that's all. Ethan stood frozen, unable to formulate a response. The innocent question had punched through his defenses with devastating accuracy. William came to his rescue. Mr. Reed has horses, Charlotte. Real fine ones. He said maybe he'd show us how to ride someday. The little girl's face brightened immediately, her attention diverted. Really? I never been on a horse before. Never been, Rebecca corrected gently, casting an apologetic glance toward Ethan. He managed a nod, moving to wash his hands in the basin as if nothing had happened. But inside, his thoughts tumbled in confusion. The child's question had awakened possibilities he'd thought long buried. After breakfast, Ethan unrolled a sheet of paper on the table, sketching out his plan for the new room. Rebecca and the children gathered around, watching as his pencil moved with practiced ease. Eastern wall gives us the most space, he explained, indicating the existing structure. 16 by 14 feet, big enough for 2 beds, a small stove for heat. That's mighty generous, Rebecca said softly. We'd be fine with just a corner of the barn. Ethan shook his head. Wyoming winters are brutal. Barn's no place for children once the real cold sets in. He continued explaining the construction, detailing the materials needed. William watched with fascination as Ethan added measurements and notes. Will it have a window? Charlotte asked, standing on tiptoes to see the drawing. Ethan hadn't considered that detail. He looked at the small face gazing up at him and made a decision. 2 windows, he said, adding them to the plan, east and south, for the morning light. Charlotte beamed. Rebecca's eyes met Ethan's over her daughter's head, a silent exchange of gratitude that made him look away first. I'll need to go to town for supplies, Ethan said, rolling up the plans. William, you think you can handle feeding the animals while I'm gone? The boy straightened, pride evident in his posture. Yes, sir, I can do it. I'll need to inventory what we have first, Ethan continued, addressing Rebecca. Could use another set of eyes if you've time. She nodded, understanding his request for help. Charlotte, why don't you play with your doll while Mr. Reed and I check the timber? The workshop revealed what Ethan already knew. His supplies were insufficient for the planned room. 8 years of solitary living had left him with enough materials for repairs and small projects, but not for a significant addition. Rebecca ran her hand along a plank of seasoned oak, appreciating its quality with a knowledgeable eye. You do beautiful work, she said, noting the carefully crafted furniture pieces stored in the workshop. Keeps my hands busy, Ethan replied, uncomfortable with the praise. And your mind quiet? She asked perceptively. He glanced at her sharply, caught off guard by her insight. She didn't press further, turning instead to the inventory list they were creating. The bed frames, she said, indicating 2 nearly completed structures in the corner. You made those recently? Ethan's jaw tightened. The truth was, he'd started them when Eleanor was pregnant, anticipating the day they'd need furniture for their growing family. After her death, he'd been unable to finish them, unable to dispose of them either. They remained like everything else in his life, suspended in the moment tragedy struck. Been working on them on and off, he said vaguely. Rebecca seemed to sense his discomfort and changed the subject. Do you sell your pieces? In town or beyond? Ethan shook his head. Just for the ranch. That's a shame. Craftsmanship like this would fetch good prices. The compliment warmed him unexpectedly. Never thought much about it. They finished the inventory in companionable silence, Rebecca proving herself knowledgeable about construction materials. Another surprise. My father was a carpenter, she explained when Ethan commented on it. Taught me to recognize good wood and respect the tools. And your husband, the miner? Rebecca's face closed slightly. Frank came from different stock. Didn't hold much with women knowing such things. Ethan nodded, understanding the volumes contained in her simple statement. Your father teach William too? Some. Frank didn't. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Frank believed boys should learn different skills. Toughness, mainly. The shadow in her eyes told Ethan all he needed to know about Frank Morton's methods of teaching toughness. Well, Ethan said, rolling up the inventory list. Reckon William might enjoy learning a bit of woodcraft, if you've no objection. Useful skill for a boy. The gratitude in Rebecca's eyes made him look away again. He wasn't accustomed to such naked emotion. I should head to town if I want to be back before dark, he said, moving toward the door. Is there anything we should do while you're gone? Rebecca asked. Any work that needs tending? Ethan considered. Cabin could use a proper cleaning, if you've a mind to. Been a while since it saw a woman's touch. He regretted the words immediately, remembering too late that they might conjure Eleanor's ghost. But Rebecca simply nodded, practical in her approach. Consider it done. The ride to Oak Ridge took nearly 2 hours, the cold air burning Ethan's lungs as his horse navigated the familiar trail. The town had grown considerably in recent years, boasting a general store, blacksmith, hardware store, 2 saloons, a small church, and a scattering of homes. The railroad 15 miles to the south had brought prosperity and new settlers, though Oak Ridge remained small compared to Cheyenne or Laramie. Ethan tied his horse outside Everett's general store, steeling himself for the inevitable interaction. Stepping inside, he found Harriet Crawford behind the counter instead of Everett himself. Ethan suppressed a grimace. Harriet, wife of the town banker, considered herself the moral authority of Oak Ridge. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. Her sharper tongue ensured everyone knew her opinions on their business. Mr. Reed, she greeted, surprise evident in her tone. Twice in 1 month. To what do we owe the pleasure? Supplies, Ethan answered curtly, handing over his list. Harriet scanned it, eyebrows rising. Building something substantial, I see. Ethan offered no explanation, which clearly irritated the woman. Heard you took in strangers, she said, not bothering with pleasantries, as she began gathering his items. A widow woman. Ethan picked up a box of nails, examining them with unnecessary attention. That's so? Folks are talking. Folks generally do. Harriet's lips thinned at his dismissive tone. A woman alone with a man, no chaperone, no family. People will wonder about propriety. Ethan set the nails down hard enough to rattle the counter. Mind your own business, Harriet. I'm just saying, she sniffed, affronted by his directness. People will wonder. Let them wonder. I've got work to do. As Harriet tallied his purchases, the bell above the door jingled. Howard Sullivan entered, removing his hat with practiced politeness. As town clerk, Sullivan presented a respectable front, but Ethan had always sensed something calculating behind the man's affable manner. Ethan Reed, Sullivan greeted expansively. Rare sight indeed. Ethan nodded curtly, eager to complete his transaction and leave. Mr. Sullivan, Harriet simpered, her demeanor changing dramatically. Such perfect timing. We were just discussing Mr. Reed's house guests. Sullivan's eyebrows rose with theatrical interest. Is that so? I'd heard whispers. A widow and her children, I understand? Ethan's jaw tightened. News traveled fast in Oak Ridge, faster than he'd anticipated. Just passing through, he said flatly. Of course, Sullivan agreed too readily. Though winter's a hard time to be traveling, especially with little ones. Very charitable of you to offer shelter. Something in Sullivan's tone raised Ethan's hackles. The man's interest seemed excessive for simple town gossip. That'll be $12.40, Harriet announced, finishing her calculations. Ethan counted out the money, aware of Sullivan watching him closely. You know, Sullivan said casually, I've always admired that parcel of yours, Reed. Prime location. Not for sale, Ethan replied automatically, having fielded similar comments from Sullivan in the past. Sullivan chuckled. Everything has its price, friend. Railroads considering a spur line through the area. Land values could change considerably. This was news to Ethan, though he kept his expression neutral. Sullivan had tried various angles over the years to acquire Ethan's land. The mention of the railroad might be truth or merely another tactic. Still not for sale, Ethan reiterated, gathering his purchases. As he turned to leave, Sullivan called after him, Give my regards to the widow Morton. Tell her if she needs anything. The town clerk's office is always open to those in difficult circumstances. Ethan didn't acknowledge the comment, pushing through the door into the cold air outside. Sullivan's interest in Rebecca unsettled him for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. Loading his supplies, Ethan noticed something in the window of the dry goods store across the street. Calico fabric, pale blue with tiny yellow flowers. Eleanor had loved fabric like that. Before he could question himself, Ethan tied his horse and entered the shop. Minutes later, he emerged with 3 yards of the calico tucked into his saddlebags. For curtains, he told himself. For the room. He didn't examine why his heart was pounding. The return journey gave Ethan too much time to think. Sullivan's comments about the railroad and his interest in Rebecca gnawed at him. If a spur line was truly planned, it explained the man's persistent attempts to acquire Ethan's land. The homestead sat at a natural juncture where a line might logically branch from the main track. More troubling was Sullivan's apparent knowledge of Rebecca. How had he learned her name, and why the pointed offer of help from the clerk's office? Ethan's instincts warned him that Sullivan was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat. The man wielded paperwork and regulations like weapons, and had connections throughout the territorial government from his position as clerk. As Ethan's homestead came into view, outlined against the late afternoon sky, he was struck by how different it looked. Smoke curled from the chimney in a welcoming plume. A clothesline had been strung between 2 posts, various items flapping in the cold breeze. Signs of life where before there had been only existence. William emerged from the barn at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, face lighting up at the sight of Ethan. The simple pleasure of the boy's recognition stirred something long dormant in Ethan's chest. Did you get everything, Mr. Reed? William called, running to help with the horse. Most of it, Ethan replied, dismounting. We can start tomorrow if the weather holds. I've been practicing with the horses like you showed me, William said eagerly. Sadie really likes me now. Horses know good people, Ethan said, surprising himself with the praise. The boy beamed, carefully taking the reins as Ethan had taught him that morning. Inside the cabin, Ethan found further transformation. The floors had been scrubbed, windows cleaned, shelves organized. The scent of stew filled the air, rich and inviting. Charlotte sat at the table, carefully folding rags into neat squares, her small face serious with concentration. Mr. Reed, she exclaimed upon seeing him. Mama made the house pretty. Rebecca turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. I hope you don't mind, seemed the least we could do. Ethan stood in the doorway, momentarily speechless. The cabin had never looked so inhabited. Even with Eleanor, they'd barely had time to settle in before tragedy struck. For 8 years, he'd maintained the structure, but neglected the touches that made a house a home. "It's fine," he managed, hanging his hat on its peg. The familiar gesture felt different somehow, as if the peg itself had changed purpose from merely holding a hat to welcoming him back. "Table's set for 4, Rebecca said, a question in her voice. Ethan nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within him. 4 plates, 4 lives intersecting by chance or providence. 4 hearts beating beneath one roof. When he'd carved Eleanor's name into that doorframe 8 years ago, he'd believed his chance at family had died with her. Now, watching Rebecca ladle stew into bowls while Charlotte chattered about her day and William proudly described his work with the horses, Ethan felt the first tentative stirrings of possibility. Not replacing what was lost, nothing could do that, but perhaps building something new from the broken pieces. As they sat down to eat, Charlotte looked up at Ethan with solemn blue eyes. "Will you say grace, Mr. Reed?" Ethan froze in the doorway. Grace at his table with a family that wasn't his. He could turn away, eat in the barn, keep the walls up. Instead, he hung his hat, sat down, and bowed his head. "Lord," he said, voice rough from disuse, "thank you for this food and for the hands that made it. Amen." When he looked up, Rebecca's eyes were shining. The room wasn't his anymore. Maybe it never would be again. And for the first time in 8 years, Ethan Reed wasn't certain that was a bad thing. After dinner, with the children settled in the barn loft, Ethan found himself alone with Rebecca by the fire. He'd brought out the bottle of whiskey he saved for the coldest nights, pouring a measure for each of them. "You don't have to talk," he said quietly as she accepted the glass, "but I'll listen if you do." She took the glass, sipped, winced slightly at the burn. Silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the pop and crackle of the fire. "Frank wasn't a good man," she said finally, staring into the flames. "Not when he drank." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her the space to continue. "He hit me. Twice. Terrified the children." Her voice was flat, emotionless, as if she'd scraped out all feeling to survive telling it. "I was ashamed, thought it was my fault, thought I deserved it." "You didn't," Ethan said simply. Rebecca looked at him, surprise evident in her expression. "How do you know?" "Because a man who raises his hand to his family isn't a man. He's a coward." Her breath hitched, the first crack in her composed facade. "I ran after he died," she admitted. "The debt was real, but I also ran because I was free." Her eyes searched his. "Does that make me terrible?" "Makes you human." They sat in silence again, more comfortable than before. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. "Earlier today," Ethan said slowly, "William asked if he could help with the horses." Rebecca nodded. "He's taken to them, and to you, if I'm not overstepping." Ethan stared at his whiskey, gathering courage. "In town, the clerk, Sullivan. He mentioned you by name." Rebecca's head snapped up, alarm crossing her features. "How would he know me?" "That's what concerned me," Ethan admitted. "He also mentioned a possible railroad spur coming through. Been trying to buy my land for years." "You think there's a connection?" Ethan shook his head. "Not to you, but Sullivan's not a man to trust. He offered his help for you. Said to tell you his office was open to those in difficult circumstances." Rebecca's fingers tightened around her glass. "Men like Sullivan don't offer help without expecting something in return." "No," Ethan agreed, "they don't." Another silence fell, heavier than before. "The railroad," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "If it's true, your land would be valuable." Ethan nodded. "Prime junction point between the main line and any spur heading northwest." "So he wants your land, and now he knows about us." Rebecca's expression grew troubled. "Our presence here could give him leverage against you." Ethan looked up sharply. "How so? A single man living alone with a widow and her children?" Rebecca's smile was bitter. "You heard the storekeeper today. People talk, and men like Sullivan know how to use talk." The realization hit Ethan with unexpected force. Their arrangement, innocent as it was, could indeed become fodder for gossip, potentially damaging to them both. "We should leave," Rebecca said quietly. "I won't be the cause of trouble for you. Not after your kindness." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Ethan intended. He moderated his tone. "Winter's setting in, you've nowhere to go, and I gave my word about that room." Rebecca reached across the space between them, touched his hand. Her palm was warm, rough, real. "I'm scared too," she whispered. "But maybe that's how we know it matters." Ethan turned his hand over, laced his fingers with hers. They didn't speak further. It was too soon, too fragile. But the touch said everything that words couldn't yet express. Outside, the wind rose. A storm was coming. Ethan could smell it on the air, feel it in the old break in his arm that ached before snow. Tomorrow they would begin building the room. Foundation, walls, roof, tangible things with clear purpose. What they were building beyond that remained unclear, shadowed with risk and possibilities neither was ready to name. But for the first time since he'd carved Eleanor's name into that doorframe, Ethan Reed found himself looking forward to the dawn. He'd promised to build a room for people who snored. It remained to be seen if he could build a home for hearts that still dreamed. Dawn broke over the Wyoming hills with the clarity only bitter cold could bring. A fresh dusting of snow had fallen overnight, transforming Ethan Reed's homestead into a canvas of pristine white, interrupted only by the dark shapes of the cabin, barn, and workshop. The temperature had risen slightly, perhaps 10 degrees above zero, what locals might call a warming trend in the heart of winter. Ethan woke before sunrise as he had for the past 8 years. But today the routine felt different. The knowledge of other breathing souls beneath his care altered everything, from the way he built up the fire in the Monarch stove to how he measured coffee grounds, making enough for 2 adults rather than just himself. He paused by the window, watching light creep across his land. 160 acres granted under the Homestead Act, worked by his hands, sanctified by his sweat, consecrated by Eleanor's grave on the small rise behind the barn, where wildflowers bloomed in summer. He'd buried his wife and infant son there 8 years ago, buried his heart alongside them. Or so he'd thought. The sound of footsteps on the porch alerted him to William's arrival. The boy entered quietly, respectful of the early hour, his breath visible in the still chilly cabin. "Morning, Mr. Reed," he whispered. "Morning," Ethan replied, noting the boy had already seen to his responsibilities in the barn. "Animals fed?" "Yes, sir. Ice broken in the troughs, too." Ethan nodded, approval evident, though unspoken. "Coffee'll be ready soon. Your ma and sister still sleeping?" "Yes, sir. Charlotte was asking questions half the night. Excited about the new room." William hesitated. "Ma told her not to get her hopes up too much. Said we'd likely move on come spring." Ethan absorbed this information silently, unsure why it settled like a stone in his gut. Of course they'd move on. That had always been the understanding. Shelter for the winter, nothing more. "Today we start building," he said, changing the subject. "After breakfast, we'll mark the foundation, see what we're working with." William's face brightened. "Can I help?" "Counting on it. Man needs good help for a project like this." The boy's chest swelled with pride, standing taller. Just then, the barn door opened, and Rebecca appeared with Charlotte in tow. The little girl skipped through the snow, delighted by the crystalline world, while Rebecca moved more carefully, her face betraying fatigue that spoke of a restless night. "Good morning," she called, her voice carrying in the crisp air. Ethan raised a hand in acknowledgement, noticing how the morning light caught in her dark hair, how her breath clouded before her like some ephemeral veil. She wore the same dress as yesterday, but had tied a woolen shawl around her shoulders, one Ethan recognized as Eleanor's. He looked away, busying himself with breakfast preparations. The past was the past. No sense in seeing ghosts in every corner. After breakfast, Ethan, Rebecca, and William stood at the eastern wall of the cabin, studying the area where the new room would extend. Charlotte had been left inside with her doll, the temperature still too cold for extended exposure. "We'll need to clear this snow, level the ground beneath," Ethan explained, marking dimensions with his boot in the powder. "Foundation needs to be solid or the whole structure fails." "What kind of foundation?" William asked, eager to understand. "Stone base laid below the frost line," Ethan replied. "Then floor joists, 16 inches on center, topped with oak planking." Rebecca studied the area, her expression thoughtful. "My father would have approved. He always said a house is only as good as what it stands on." "Your father was right," Ethan said, surprised by her knowledge. "I've got stones stockpiled behind the workshop. We'll need to dig down about 2 feet to get below the frost line, though with the ground frozen, that'll be our biggest challenge." "In the mines," Rebecca offered hesitantly, "they'd sometimes use small controlled fires to thaw frozen ground before digging." Ethan considered this. Risky near a wooden structure, but if we're careful, might work. We could build small fire pits along the perimeter. Let them burn through the night, then dig tomorrow. "I can help with that," William volunteered. "Good." Let's get those stones and start marking the fire pits. They worked through the morning, Ethan teaching William how to arrange the stones in a small circle while leaving air channels for proper burning. Rebecca proved surprisingly adept, demonstrating knowledge of construction that exceeded Ethan's expectations. My father let me help more than most, she explained when he commented on it. Had no sons, just me. Said there was no sense in knowledge going to waste just because I wore skirts. Ethan nodded, appreciating the practical wisdom. Lucky for us, he thought that way. By midday, they'd established 4 small fire pits along what would become the foundation line. Ethan carefully measured the dimensions one final time, ensuring perfect alignment with the existing structure. We'll light these around sunset, he decided. Let them burn through the night. For now, let's get the timber ready. Need to sort what we have, prepare the joints where the new wall will connect to the old. They moved to the workshop where Ethan had arranged the materials purchased in town alongside his existing supplies. William's eyes widened at the array of tools hanging from pegs on the wall, each meticulously maintained. Never seen so many, he breathed, taking in the collection of saws, planes, chisels, and augers. Every tool has its purpose, Ethan said, selecting a cross-cut saw from the wall. This here's for cutting across the grain of the wood. That one there, he pointed to a ripsaw, cuts with the grain. Using the right tool makes the work cleaner, faster. He demonstrated the proper technique, showing William how to hold the saw, how to let the teeth do the work rather than forcing it. The boy watched with rapt attention, absorbing every detail. Want to try? Ethan offered, holding out the saw. William nodded eagerly, taking the tool with reverent hands. Ethan guided him through the first cut on a length of pine, standing behind the boy, his larger hands encompassing William's to demonstrate the rhythm. Steady pressure. Let the saw do the work, he instructed. That's it. Rebecca watched from nearby, her eyes softening at the tableau they presented. Man and boy, teacher and student, the legacy of craft passing from one generation to another. When William completed his first cut successfully, his face shone with accomplishment. I did it, he exclaimed. You did, Ethan confirmed, squeezing the boy's shoulder. The contact felt strange, good, terrifying. They worked through the afternoon, Ethan teaching William basic carpentry skills, while Rebecca sorted nails by size and prepared bindings for the joists. The hours passed in comfortable productivity, punctuated by William's questions and Ethan's patient explanations. When the light began to fade, they lit the small fires along the foundation line, carefully building each one with dry wood that would burn hot and long. The flames cast dancing shadows across the snow, creating a perimeter of warmth in the gathering dusk. It's like magic, William whispered, watching the firelight play across the white ground. No magic, Ethan corrected, just understanding how things work together. Fire, earth, wood, human hands, all got their place. As darkness settled fully, they returned to the warmth of the cabin. Charlotte greeted them excitedly, proudly displaying a row of neatly folded rags she'd completed in their absence. I'm helping too, she declared. Indeed you are, Rebecca affirmed, removing her shawl and hanging it carefully on a peg. Most important job of all, keeping house while we work. The evening meal was simpler than the previous night, salt pork with beans and cornbread, but the shared labor had sharpened their appetites. They ate heartily, the conversation flowing more easily now, centered around the day's work and plans for tomorrow. After the children had been settled in the barn loft, Ethan and Rebecca again found themselves alone by the fire. The ritual of the previous night repeated itself, Ethan pouring 2 small measures of whiskey, the golden liquid catching the firelight like amber. Your William's a quick study, Ethan commented, settling into his chair. He is, Rebecca agreed, pride evident in her voice. Never had much chance to show it before. Frank didn't, she trailed off. Didn't encourage learning, Ethan finished for her. She nodded, sipping her whiskey. Frank believed a boy should be tough above all else. Education was for weaklings, in his mind. Schooling was irregular at best in the mining camp anyway. Boy deserves better, Ethan said simply. Both my children do, Rebecca replied, her gaze direct. It's why we left after Frank died. Why I couldn't accept the mining company's offer of another cabin. Another miner looking for a ready-made family. The cycle would have continued. Ethan studied her face in the firelight, seeing the determination there, the fierce protective love of a mother. It struck him suddenly how much courage it must have taken to leave everything familiar, to walk into the unknown with 2 children and no guarantee of safety. You're a brave woman, Rebecca Morton, he said quietly. She looked startled, then shook her head. Not brave, desperate. There's a difference. Sometimes they look the same from the outside, Ethan observed. The fire popped, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving fine snow against the windows with a sound like sand on glass. Storm's coming, Ethan noted. Will it affect the fires for the foundation? Shouldn't. They're sheltered enough, burn hot enough. We'll check them at first light. Rebecca nodded, then hesitated, gathering courage for something. Mr. Reed, Ethan, I need to be direct about something. He braced himself, uncertain what was coming. All right, your land, this Sullivan man's interest. Our presence here seems to have complicated things for you. Not your concern, Ethan replied automatically. It is if we are the cause, Rebecca countered. I've known men like Sullivan. They use whatever leverage they can find. If he thinks, she paused, searching for delicate words. If he thinks our arrangement is improper, he could make trouble. For both of us. Ethan's jaw tightened. Let him try. You don't understand. Men like that don't fight fair. They use the law, twist it to serve their purposes. In the mining camps, I saw company men take homes, livelihoods, even children through legal maneuvering. The mention of children made Ethan's stomach clench. He'd have no grounds. Doesn't he? Rebecca asked softly. The Homestead Act requires family residency, doesn't it? You've been alone for 8 years, and now suddenly there's a woman and children living on your property? He could argue you're attempting to fraudulently maintain your claim. Ethan stared at her, unsettled by her insight. The thought hadn't occurred to him, but she was right. Sullivan was clever enough to twist their innocent arrangement into something that could threaten his land claim. Or, Rebecca continued, her voice even softer, he could attack from the moral angle. A single man, a widow, improper living arrangements. Small towns run on reputation, Ethan. I've seen good people ostracized for less. The implications hung in the air between them. Ethan took a long swallow of whiskey, letting it burn down his throat. What are you suggesting? He asked finally. I'm not suggesting anything, Rebecca replied. Just making sure you understand what your kindness to us might cost you. When spring comes, we'll move on. Find somewhere new to start over. The thought of them leaving sent an unexpected pang through Ethan's chest. He attributed it to concern for their welfare. Nothing more. Spring's a long way off, he said. For now, we focus on the room, one day at a time. Rebecca studied him for a moment, then nodded, accepting his decision not to engage further with the uncomfortable topic. She finished her whiskey and stood, smoothing her skirt. Good night, Ethan Reed. Good night, Rebecca Morton. After she'd gone, Ethan remained by the fire, turning her words over in his mind. She'd given voice to concerns that had been forming at the edges of his consciousness. Sullivan's interest in his land had always been persistent, but never threatening until now. The man clearly saw an opportunity in Rebecca and the children's presence, though exactly what angle he might pursue remained unclear. Ethan thought of Eleanor, wondering what she would advise. She'd been pragmatic, clear-eyed about people's motives. She'd also had a generous heart, opening their home to travelers even when they had little to spare. What would you have me do, Ellie? He whispered to the empty room. The fire offered no answers, just the steady consumption of wood into ash, the inevitable transformation of substance into memory. Morning revealed the storm's passing, leaving another inch of snow in its wake. The foundation fires had burned through the night as planned, creating 4 circles of thawed earth where they would begin digging. Ethan rose early to check them, finding William already there, carefully adding small pieces of wood to maintain the heat. Thought they might go out in the storm, the boy explained. Been tending them since before dawn. Ethan felt a surge of approval at the boy's initiative. Good thinking. Ready to start digging once these cool a bit? William nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. They returned to the cabin for breakfast, where Rebecca had coffee brewing and oatmeal bubbling on the stove. Charlotte sat at the table drawing patterns on a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil Ethan had given her. Look, Mr. Reed, she said as he entered, holding up her creation. It's our new room. The childish drawing showed a square attached to a larger square, stick figures standing inside, sun shining through what must be windows. Something about the simple representation, the innocent expectation it contained, caught Ethan in the chest. That's fine work, Charlotte, he said, his voice gruffer than he intended. When will it be done? She asked, eyes bright with anticipation. Takes time to build something right, Ethan answered, hanging his hat. Week or 2, weather permitting. That soon? Rebecca asked, surprised. With good help, yes, Ethan replied, glancing at William. Boy's got a natural touch with tools. William straightened at the praise, a flush of pride coloring his cheeks. Rebecca's eyes met Ethan's over her son's head, gratitude evident in her gaze. After breakfast, they began the laborious process of digging the foundation. The fires had thawed the earth to a depth of nearly a foot, but below that, the ground remained frozen. They worked in shifts, Ethan and William taking turns with the pickaxe to break through the frozen layer, Rebecca clearing away the loosened soil with a shovel. By midday, they had established the perimeter trench to the required depth. Ethan showed William how to lay the first stones, creating a level base upon which the entire structure would rest. These need to be solid, he explained, demonstrating how to check each stone with a level. Any wobble now will mean trouble later. William absorbed the instruction with serious concentration, placing each stone with careful deliberation, adjusting until Ethan nodded approval. As they worked, Rebecca periodically checked on Charlotte, who had taken to playing in the snow near the worksite, creating a small village of snow mounds she called houses. The little girl's imagination transformed the simplest elements into elaborate stories, her voice carrying in the clear air as she narrated adventures for her rag doll among the snow dwellings. She has Ellie's gift for seeing more than what's there, Ethan said quietly to Rebecca as they watched Charlotte direct her doll through an imaginary doorway. Rebecca glanced at him, surprised by the personal admission. Eleanor, your wife? Ethan nodded, returning his attention to the foundation stones. She could look at a piece of raw timber and describe exactly what it would become. Said the shape was always there, just waiting to be released. That's beautiful, Rebecca said softly. What did she look like? The question caught Ethan off guard. He rarely spoke of Eleanor, and when he did, it was never about such personal details. Yet somehow in this moment, with his hands working the earth where a new room would stand, the answer came without pain. Fair hair, like Charlotte's, blue eyes, smiled with her whole face, not just her mouth. He paused, remembering. Hands always busy, making, fixing, creating, never still. Rebecca absorbed this, nodding. She sounds remarkable. She was, Ethan confirmed, then added after a moment, would have liked you, I think. Practical women understand each other. The compliment, simple as it was, brought color to Rebecca's cheeks. Thank you. They worked through the afternoon, completing the foundation stone placement as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. Tomorrow they would begin the floor joist, the first vertical elements that would transform the flat perimeter into a three-dimensional space. As they gathered their tools at day's end, William paused, looking back at their work with satisfaction. It's really happening, and he said, wonder in his voice. We're really building a room. That we are, Ethan confirmed, resting a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. You did good work today. William beamed at their praise, standing taller. Pa never let me help with building, said I'd just mess it up. The casual revelation of Frank Morton's belittling attitude toward his son hardened Ethan's resolve to teach the boy properly, to show him his worth through action rather than words. Some men fear being surpassed by their sons, Ethan said carefully. Makes them poor teachers. William considered this, nodding slowly as if pieces of a puzzle were fitting together in his mind. Is that why you're a good teacher? Because you don't fear that? The innocent question struck Ethan with unexpected force. Never had the chance to find out, he answered honestly. But a man who can't take pride in those who learn from him has missed the point of knowledge altogether. The boy nodded solemnly, absorbing the wisdom. They walked back to the cabin together in companionable silence, the lessons of the day settling into both their minds in different ways. That evening after supper, Ethan unrolled the building plans on the table, showing Rebecca and William the next stages of construction. Floor joists first, he explained, pointing to the diagram, then wall framing, roof beams, and finally exterior walls, windows, and door. When do we add the pretty blue cloth? Charlotte asked, peering at the plans with interest. Ethan looked at her in confusion. What blue cloth? The one in your saddlebag, she replied innocently. I saw it when you came back from town. It's for curtains, isn't it? Rebecca glanced at Ethan, surprise evident in her expression. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the revelation. Thought it might brighten things up, he muttered, once the room's done. Rebecca's eyes softened, understanding the significance of the gesture. That's very thoughtful, Ethan. He shrugged, rolling up the plans to hide his discomfort with her gratitude. Windows need curtains, practical consideration. Later, after the children had gone to the barn loft, Rebecca broached the subject again as they sat by the fire. The fabric, she said quietly. Blue calico with yellow flowers. It's like Eleanor's, isn't it? Ethan stared into the flames, considering denial, then opted for truth. She had a dress made from similar, always said it reminded her of sky and sunshine, even in winter. Rebecca nodded, understanding. It was a kind thought. Not kindness, Ethan corrected, just seemed right somehow. They sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling between them, each lost in private thoughts. Finally, Rebecca spoke again, her voice tentative. William told me what you said today about teachers and knowledge. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unused to having his words repeated back to him. Just speaking truth as I see it. It meant something to him, Rebecca pressed gently. Frank, he broke things in William. Confidence, trust, the belief that he could be good at anything. Ethan's jaw tightened at the thought of a father deliberately diminishing his son. Boy's got natural ability, steady hands, good eye for detail. He needs to hear that, Rebecca said, from a man he respects. The implication that William respected him settled strangely in Ethan's chest, a weight both burdensome and precious. He wasn't accustomed to being looked up to having his words carry such significance in a child's life. I'm not one for excessive praise, he said carefully, but I won't lie to the boy either. He does good work. I'll tell him so. Rebecca smiled, satisfied with this commitment. That's all I ask. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for construction. They began early, Ethan demonstrating how to measure and cut the floor joists that would support the room's wooden floor. 16 inches on center, he explained to William, means the middle of each joist is exactly 16 inches from the next. Creates even support for the floorboards above. William nodded, helping to hold the measuring line as Ethan marked each position with a piece of chalk. They worked methodically, cutting each joist to precise lengths, notching the ends to sit securely on the foundation stones. Rebecca joined them after settling Charlotte with her doll and drawing supplies, rolling up her sleeves to help position the heavy timbers. Her strength surprised Ethan, though he was coming to understand that Rebecca Morton contained many unexpected qualities beneath her reserved exterior. By midday, the floor frame had taken shape, 16 parallel joists running east to west, creating the skeleton of what would become the floor. Ethan showed William how to secure each joist with iron brackets he'd purchased in town, the boy driving nails with increasing confidence. As they worked, Ethan found himself watching Rebecca more often than he intended. The winter sunlight caught in her dark hair, revealing strands of auburn he hadn't noticed before. Her movements were efficient, economical, without wasted effort. She worked alongside him as an equal, anticipating needs, suggesting solutions when challenges arose. Once their hands brushed as they both reached for the same tool. The brief contact sent an unexpected current through Ethan's arm, causing him to draw back more quickly than necessary. Rebecca's eyes met his for a moment, something unreadable passing between them before they both returned to their tasks, neither acknowledging the moment. By late afternoon, they had completed the floor joist installation and begun laying the oak floorboards Ethan had been seasoning in his workshop. The rich golden wood gleamed in the fading light as they fitted each board tightly against its neighbor. Oak's harder than pine, Ethan explained as they worked. More durable for flooring. These boards were milled from trees I felled 3 years ago, been drying in the workshop ever since. You planned that far ahead? William asked, impressed. Good timber needs proper seasoning, Ethan replied. Rush it, you get boards that warp and twist after installation. Patience makes the difference between work that lasts and work that fails. Rebecca smiled at the lesson, recognizing how Ethan's approach to woodworking reflected his entire worldview. Patient, methodical, committed to quality over expediency. It explained much about the man, including his 8 years of solitude. Ethan Reed didn't rush healing any more than he rushed seasoning timber. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their work, Ethan stood to assess their progress. The floor was nearly 2/3 complete, the golden oak creating a warm contrast to the snow surrounding it. Good day's work, he declared, satisfaction evident in his tone. Tomorrow we'll finish the floor and start on the wall framing. William beamed with pride, running a hand over the smooth planking they'd installed. It's beautiful, he said simply. That it is, Ethan agreed, allowing himself a moment of pride. Oak's got character. Each board tells its own story in the grain. They gathered their tools as darkness approached, the temperature dropping rapidly with the sun's departure. Charlotte had spent the afternoon alternating between watching their work and playing in the snow, creating an elaborate village of snow structures near the construction site. Now she stood on the partially completed floor, spinning in slow circles. It feels like dancing, she declared, arms outstretched. So smooth under my feet. Ethan watched her childish delight, something warming in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. That's how you know it's good craftsmanship, he told her solemnly. Makes you want to dance. Charlotte giggled, continuing her twirls until Rebecca gently guided her off the new flooring. Come along now. Time to get warm inside. Mr. Reed and William need to put the tools away. As Rebecca and Charlotte headed toward the cabin, William helped Ethan gather the remaining tools, working with the quiet efficiency of established routine despite the newness of their partnership. Mr. Reed, the boy asked as they walked toward the workshop. Do you think, could I someday be good enough to build something all on my own? Like a whole cabin? Ethan considered the question seriously. No reason why not. Takes time to learn all the skills, but you've got the makings. Good hands, willing to listen, not afraid of hard work. William absorbed this assessment, nodding thoughtfully. I'd like that. To build something that lasts, something people could live in and be safe. The simple aspiration revealed volumes about the boy's past, about what had been lacking in his life with Frank Morton. Safety, permanence, the dignity of creation rather than destruction. That's a worthy ambition, Ethan told him, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder. One day at a time, though, master each skill thoroughly before moving to the next. They stored the tools carefully in the workshop, each returned to its proper place on the wall. As they prepared to leave, William paused by the door frame where Eleanor and baby James' names were carved. Did you make this? He asked quietly, fingers hovering near but not touching the carving. Ethan nodded, something tightening in his throat. I did. It's like they're still part of the house, William observed, even though they're gone. That's the idea, Ethan managed, surprised by the boy's perception. Some things shouldn't be forgotten. William was quiet for a moment, then asked, could you show me how to carve like that someday? The request caught Ethan off guard. He studied the boy's face, seeing genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. I could, he said finally. Takes a steady hand and patience. William nodded solemnly. I'd practice hard. I believe you would, Ethan replied, oddly moved by the boy's determination. When they returned to the cabin, they found Rebecca at the stove and Charlotte at the table, carefully folding clean rags as she had appointed herself to do. The domestic scene struck Ethan with unexpected force, the simple normalcy of it highlighting how abnormal his existence had been these past 8 years. Dinner that evening was venison stew, rich with root vegetables from Ethan's cellar. They ate heartily, the physical labor of the day having sharpened their appetites. The conversation flowed more naturally now, the initial awkwardness of strangers having given way to the comfortable rhythm of shared purpose. After the meal, while Rebecca supervised Charlotte's preparations for bed, Ethan took William outside to check on the animals one final time. The night was clear, stars piercing the black sky with diamond clarity, the air so cold it burned the lungs. Sky like this means temperatures dropping fast, Ethan commented as they walked toward the barn. Might hit 20 below by morning. William shivered, pulling his coat tighter. Will it be too cold to work on the room? We'll work inside tomorrow, Ethan replied, cutting the wall studs and assembling the frames in the workshop where it's warmer. Then we'll move them into place when they're ready. The boy nodded, satisfied with this plan. As they entered the barn, the familiar smells of hay and horses enveloped them, along with the welcome increase in temperature from the animals' body heat. Ethan checked each stall methodically, ensuring water troughs were full and bedding adequate for the extreme cold. William followed, absorbing the routine, learning without formal instruction the daily rhythms of proper animal husbandry. Mr. Reed, he asked as they finished their tasks. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. William hesitated, gathering courage. Why did you decide to let us stay? Ma says most folks would have turned us away. The question was direct, honest in the way only children can be. Ethan considered it carefully, owing the boy the same honesty. Sometimes a man doesn't know why he does something until after it's done, he said finally. Saw you three on that porch. Something just felt right about helping. Can't explain it better than that. William absorbed this, nodding slowly. I'm glad you did, even if we leave in spring. The reminder of their eventual departure sat uncomfortably in Ethan's chest. He busied himself with checking a bridle hanging on the wall, avoiding the boy's eyes. Spring's a long way off, he repeated his words from the previous night to Rebecca. For now, we've got a room to build. William seemed satisfied with this answer. As they prepared to leave the barn, the boy paused, looking up at the loft where he and his family had been sleeping. Ma cries sometimes at night, he said quietly, when she thinks Charlotte and me are asleep. She didn't do that at our old house, even when Pa was mean. But now she does. The confession caught Ethan off guard. its simplicity masking the complexity of emotion behind it. Your ma's carried a heavy load, Ma, he said carefully. Sometimes when folks finally find a safe place, that's when the tears come. Doesn't mean she's sadder now. Might mean she finally feels safe enough to let it out. William considered this explanation, finding comfort in its logic. You think that's it? That she feels safe here? I hope so, Ethan replied honestly. Aim to make it so, least while you're under my roof. The boy nodded, satisfied. As they walked back to the cabin through the crystalline night, William's small hand slipped into Ethan's, the gesture so natural that neither commented on it. Their breath clouded before them in the starlight, two souls connected by circumstance, finding their way forward one step at a time. Inside the cabin, Rebecca had settled Charlotte in a makeshift bed near the fire, the little girl already drowsy with warmth and security. Rebecca herself sat at the table, mending one of William's shirts by the light of a kerosene lamp, her needle flashing silver as it dipped and rose through the fabric. The scene struck Ethan with its simple rightness, as if the cabin itself had been waiting 8 years for just this tableau. He hung his hat, the gesture no longer merely functional but somehow significant, marking his return not just to a structure but to a home. Animals are settled, he reported quietly, mindful of Charlotte's drooping eyelids. Temperatures dropping fast outside. Rebecca nodded, setting aside her mending. I've added wood to the stove. Should keep through the night. You two should take the bedroom tonight, Ethan said, the words emerging before he'd fully considered them. Too cold for the barn loft with this weather coming. Rebecca looked up sharply, surprise evident in her expression. We couldn't. That's your room. I'll take the chair by the fire, Ethan insisted. Done it plenty of times before. Bed's big enough for you and Charlotte. William can make a pallet here in the main room near the stove. William looked between the adults, sensing the significance of the offer, though not fully understanding it. Rebecca hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and practical concern for her children. Just for tonight, Ethan added, with the cold snap. Tomorrow we can figure something better. Are you certain? Rebecca asked, searching his face. Wouldn't offer if I wasn't, he replied simply. She studied him a moment longer, then nodded. Thank you. Just for tonight, then. The matter settled, they completed their evening routine with newfound awareness of each other's movements, the small cabin suddenly feeling both more crowded and more complete than before. As Rebecca guided a sleepy Charlotte toward the bedroom, Ethan prepared a pallet for William near the stove, showing the boy how to arrange the blankets for maximum warmth. Sleep well, Rebecca said softly from the bedroom doorway, her eyes meeting Ethan's with complex emotion. And thank you. Ethan nodded, unable to find adequate words for what was passing between them in that moment. As she closed the door, he settled into his chair by the fire, aware of William's steady breathing from the pallet nearby, of Charlotte's occasional murmur from the bedroom, of Rebecca's quiet movements as she prepared for sleep. 4 souls under one roof, 4 hearts beating in the wilderness, 4 lives intersecting by chance or providence. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, stars blazing in the black sky with fierce clarity. Inside, warmth radiated from the stove, from the banked fire, from the simple fact of human proximity after long isolation. Ethan stared into the dying embers, thinking of the room taking shape outside, of the oak floor gleaming in tomorrow's sunlight, of walls that would soon rise to create a space that hadn't existed before. A room born from a casual promise, evolving into something more significant with each passing day. If they snore, I'll build a room, he'd said. But what he was building, he realized now, was far more complicated than timber and nails could account for. Something both terrifying and necessary, like the first breath after long submersion. He was building possibility. The extreme cold held Wyoming in its grip for 3 days, forcing Ethan and the Mortons to adapt their building strategy. Rather than working outside on the foundation, they retreated to the workshop where Ethan had taught William and Rebecca to prepare the wall framing. By the 3rd morning, the temperature had moderated enough to resume outdoor work, the thermometer outside Ethan's window reading a relatively mild 0 degrees. Dawn found Ethan already at work, carefully positioning the oak floorboards they would finish laying today. The rhythm of construction had begun to shape their days, creating a natural order that suited Ethan's methodical nature. The floor structure was nearly complete, its golden surface gleaming in the early morning light, a testament to craftsmanship and care. As he worked, Ethan heard the cabin door open, followed by William's eager footsteps crunching across the snow. The boy had proven himself an early riser, consistently joining Ethan before Rebecca and Charlotte stirred. These quiet morning hours had developed into a time of simple companionship between them, conversations emerging naturally as they worked side by side. "Morning, Mr. Reed," William greeted, breath clouding in the cold air. "Morning," Ethan replied, pleased by the boy's punctuality. "Thought we'd finish this flooring today. Start setting the wall frames tomorrow." William nodded, eyes bright with anticipation. "The frames we built in the workshop?" "That's right. 4 wall sections, all ready to raise once we secure this floor proper." The boy studied the partially completed floor with pride. His contributions over the past days might have been small, but Ethan had made certain they were meaningful, teaching rather than simply directing. William had driven nails, measured boards, and even made several cuts under Ethan's watchful guidance. "Ma says it's going to be the finest room in Wyoming territory," William reported, kneeling to examine the tight-fitting joints between boards. Ethan felt an unexpected warmth at Rebecca's assessment. "Your ma's being generous. There are finer houses in Cheyenne and Laramie." "But not with floors like this," William insisted, running his hand over the smooth oak surface. "Ma says most folks use pine, not oak this fine." "Your ma knows her timber," Ethan acknowledged, impressed again by Rebecca's knowledge. "Oak's harder to work but lasts longer. Floor like this will outlive us all." Something in that statement caught him off guard, the casual assumption of permanence. The floor would indeed outlast them all, but the Mortons wouldn't be here to walk upon it beyond spring. The thought settled uneasily in his chest as he reached for another board. They worked steadily through the morning, Rebecca joining them after breakfast with Charlotte bundled against the cold. The little girl had appointed herself supervisor, sitting on a crate Ethan had positioned safely away from the construction, her doll propped beside her as she solemnly observed their progress. "You're doing very well," she informed them periodically, mimicking the serious tone of an adult inspector. Her innocent commentary lightened their work, drawing smiles even from Ethan. By midday, the floor was complete, a 16 by 14-foot rectangle of polished oak extending from the eastern wall of the cabin. Standing at its center, Ethan felt satisfaction in the solid craftsmanship beneath his feet. No creaks, no gaps, just the unyielding strength of properly seasoned wood. "Tomorrow we raise the walls," he announced as they gathered their tools. 4 sections, each pre-framed. "We'll need all hands to lift and secure them." "Like a barn raising?" William asked eagerly. "Similar principle, smaller scale," Ethan confirmed. "First the exterior walls, then interior finishing. Roof last." Rebecca nodded, understanding the process. "My father always said the key to wall raising was preparation. Everything must be ready before the first wall goes up." "Your father had it right," Ethan agreed. "We'll check all the frames tonight, make sure everything's square and true." As they returned to the cabin for the midday meal, Ethan noticed Rebecca studying the position of the new room relative to the existing structure, her expression thoughtful. "Something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not wrong, just thinking about the layout. The room will have no direct access to the cabin, will it? They'll need to go outside to come in." The observation gave Ethan pause. In his planning, he had indeed designed the room as a separate space with its own exterior door. The possibility of connecting it directly to the main cabin through an interior doorway hadn't occurred to him, perhaps because he had unconsciously maintained a boundary between his space and theirs. "Could cut a connecting door through the eastern wall," he said slowly, considering the structural implications. "Would require reframing that section, but it's possible." Rebecca looked away. "I shouldn't have mentioned it. The room is already more than generous." "No, it's a practical consideration," Ethan insisted, mentally revising his plans. "Wyoming winters, going outside to move between rooms makes little sense. We'll add a connecting door." The decision felt significant somehow, beyond its practical value. A connecting door meant integration rather than separation, a merging of spaces rather than distinct territories. Ethan pushed the symbolism from his mind, focusing instead on the technical requirements of the modification. That afternoon, they returned to the workshop where Ethan showed William how to modify one of the wall frames to accommodate an interior doorway. The boy proved an apt pupil, carefully measuring the required dimensions and marking the timber for cutting. "Door frames need extra support," Ethan explained, demonstrating how to double the vertical studs on either side of the opening. "They carry more weight, need to be stronger than regular wall sections." William absorbed this knowledge with serious concentration, his natural aptitude for construction becoming more evident with each passing day. Rebecca worked nearby, preparing the window frames with equal care, her movements efficient and precise. Watching them work, Ethan was struck by how quickly they had adapted to his methods, how seamlessly they had integrated into the rhythms of his solitary existence. The workshop, once his private sanctuary, now felt more alive with their presence, the shared purpose giving new meaning to tasks he had performed alone for 8 years. As daylight faded, they returned to the cabin where Charlotte had spent the afternoon carefully cutting rectangles from the blue calico fabric under Rebecca's earlier instruction. The little girl proudly displayed her work, small patches that would eventually become curtains for the new room. "Look, Mr. Reed," she exclaimed, "I'm helping with the building too." Ethan nodded gravely, acknowledging her contribution. "Every part matters, no matter how small. That's good work, Charlotte." Her face glowed with the praise, small chest puffing with pride. "Will the curtains keep the monsters away?" The question caught Ethan off guard. Rebecca intervened smoothly, stroking her daughter's hair. "There are no monsters, Charlotte." "But William said there are wolves in the woods," the little girl persisted, "and bears sleeping in caves." "Wolves and bears aren't monsters," Ethan explained, kneeling to meet her eye level. "They're just animals living as they were made to. They stay in their territory, we stay in ours. Respect that boundary, there's rarely trouble." Charlotte considered this seriously. But what if they don't respect the boundary? The question held more wisdom than the child could know. Ethan's thoughts flashed to Howard Sullivan and his persistent interest in the land. "Then you need strong walls," Ethan replied, "and people who stand together." Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed in the barn loft, the cold having moderated enough to make it comfortable again, Ethan and Rebecca sat by the fire. 3 days of working in close quarters had changed something between them, the initial wariness giving way to a comfortable familiarity. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ethan began, staring into the flames, "about Sullivan and the Homestead Act." Rebecca looked up from her mending, expression cautious. "Yes? Been here 8 years," Ethan continued. "Original certificate should have converted to full deed after 5. But there was an issue with the survey lines. Government surveyors claimed part of the eastern boundary overlapped with Federal Reserve land. Been in dispute ever since." Understanding dawned in Rebecca's eyes. "And Sullivan knows about this dispute." Ethan nodded grimly. "As town clerk, he'd have access to all the records. Been trying to buy me out for years, offering less than half what the land's worth. If what you said about a railroad spur is true," explains his persistence, "and our presence here gives him a new angle of attack," Rebecca surmised. "If he can't get the land through purchase, perhaps he can challenge your claim on moral or legal grounds." "Man like Sullivan rarely has just one strategy," Ethan agreed. "I'd be a fool to underestimate him." Rebecca set her mending aside, her face troubled in the firelight. "What will you do?" Ethan considered this, weighing options. "First, secure what's mine legally. Need to ride to the county seat, check the status of my claim, make sure everything's properly recorded. Been putting it off too long. And if Sullivan makes trouble before then, let him try," Ethan said simply, the quiet confidence in his voice masking the concern he felt. He had lived peacefully for 8 years, avoiding conflict and entanglement. Now, with the Mortons under his protection, he found himself preparing for a fight he had long avoided. The thought should have troubled him more than it did. Instead, he felt a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced since Eleanor's death. Protecting what was his, defending those who depended on him, these were responsibilities a man could stand firmly behind. "When will you go?" Rebecca asked. "After we raise the walls," Ethan decided. 2, 3 days at most. County seat's a day's ride each way. Rebecca nodded, then hesitated, gathering courage. "Ethan, there's something I should tell you about Frank." The change in subject caught him off guard. He waited, giving her space to continue. "I told you he died in a mine collapse," she said slowly. "That's true, but I didn't tell you everything." She drew a deep breath. "Frank had enemies. His drinking, his temper. He left debts beyond what the creditors claimed from our house." Ethan's jaw tightened, sensing where this was leading. "Before we left Colorado," Rebecca continued, "a man came to the house, said Frank owed him money from gambling, threatened the children if I didn't pay." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I had nothing left to give him. That's the real reason we walked 3 days to get here. I was afraid he'd come back." The confession hung in the air between them. Rebecca's eyes fixed on the fire, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. "This man," Ethan asked carefully, "you think he followed you?" Rebecca shook her head. "No, but the world is smaller than we think. Word travels. If someone from Silverton passed through Oak Ridge, mentioned a widow with 2 children, She left the implication unspoken. Ethan considered this new information, slotting it alongside his concerns about Sullivan. The possibility of danger from two directions complicated matters. "What was his name?" he asked. "This man who threatened you." "James Kelly," Rebecca replied. "Irish accent, scar across his right cheek. Worked as a foreman at the Blue River mine." Ethan nodded, committing the description to memory. "Appreciate you telling me. Changes nothing about your welcome here, but good to know what might be coming." Relief softened Rebecca's features. "Thank you. I should have told you sooner. But I was afraid that I'd send you away," Ethan finished for her. "No need to explain. Man's past has a way of following those left behind through no fault of their own." They sat in companionable silence, the revelation having shifted something between them. Trust given and received, a strengthening of the fragile bonds forming in this unexpected arrangement. "When spring comes," Rebecca said softly, "we'll move on. Take whatever trouble follows us away from your door." The statement, meant to reassure, instead settled like a stone in Ethan's chest. The image of the Mortons continuing their uncertain journey, facing danger alone, troubled him more than he cared to admit. "Spring's a long way off," he repeated his now familiar refrain. "Let's see these walls raised first." Morning arrived bright and cold, the sun glinting off snow crystals with diamond brilliance. Ethan rose early, checking and rechecking the wall frames in the workshop before moving them carefully to the building site. Each frame had been constructed with precision, corners squared, studs evenly spaced, headers and footers solidly joined. William found him there, making final preparations for the wall raising. The boy's enthusiasm was palpable as he circled the frames, examining Ethan's modifications for the connecting doorway. "Will they be hard to lift?" he asked, running his hand along the substantial timbers. "Heavy but manageable with the three of us," Ethan replied. "Built a frame on the inside corner that lets us raise it in sections rather than all at once." Rebecca joined them after breakfast, Charlotte once again bundled against the cold but determined to witness the wall raising. The little girl perched on her crate with her doll, solemnly accepting her role as supervisor. "Everyone ready?" Ethan asked, positioning himself at one end of the first wall section. Rebecca and William took their places, hands firm on the wooden frame. "Lift steady, not quick. On three. 1, 2, 3. They raised the first wall with careful coordination, Ethan guiding it into position while Rebecca and William provided the lifting force. Once vertical, Ethan quickly secured it with temporary braces, preventing it from tipping while they positioned the next section. "Well done," he acknowledged, checking that the frame stood true. "One down, 3 to go." They worked methodically through the morning, raising each wall section into position, securing it to its neighbors, checking and rechecking that every angle stood square. By midday, all 4 walls were standing, creating for the first time the three-dimensional outline of the room that would soon be. Standing inside the frame, Rebecca turned slowly, taking in the space. Sunlight streamed through the empty window openings, casting geometric patterns on the oak floor. "It's larger than I imagined," she said softly. 16 by 14, Ethan confirmed. "Room for 2 beds, small stove, table if needed." Charlotte skipped through the doorway, spinning in the center of the room with childish delight. "Is this our house now?" The innocent question highlighted the temporary nature of their arrangement. Rebecca smiled gently at her daughter. "It's Mr. Reed's house, Charlotte. He's kindly letting us use it for the winter." Ethan turned away, busying himself with checking the corner joints. The reminder shouldn't have troubled him, yet it did. He had built this room knowing it would eventually stand empty, yet somehow that future had begun to seem less certain in his mind. They ate a quick midday meal, then returned to continue work on the wall framing, securing each joint permanently, adding the horizontal nailers that would support the exterior siding and interior wall covering. William worked alongside Ethan with growing confidence, his natural aptitude for construction becoming more evident with each task. "You've got a good eye," Ethan told him, as the boy correctly identified a stud that had warped slightly. "Most folks wouldn't notice that difference." William straightened with pride at the praise. "Pa always said I noticed too much. Said it made me soft." Ethan's jaw tightened at this further evidence of Frank Morton's failings as a father. Noticing details doesn't make a man soft, makes him observant. Good trait for any craftsman. The boy absorbed this perspective, nodding slowly. "Like how you noticed the grain pattern in that oak board yesterday? How you turned it to make the pattern flow with the others." "Exactly like that," Ethan confirmed, pleased by the boy's recall. "Craftsmanship is attention to details others might miss. Nothing soft about that." As afternoon waned, they began work on the roof beams, heavy timbers that would span the width of the room, supporting the roof structure above. Each beam required precise notching to fit securely into the top plates of the walls, creating a solid connection that would withstand Wyoming's fierce winter winds. Ethan demonstrated the technique to William, showing him how to measure twice before cutting, how to test each fit before declaring it complete. The boy absorbed these lessons eagerly, his hands growing steadier with each attempt, his confidence building under Ethan's patient guidance. Rebecca worked nearby, preparing the smaller rafters that would connect to the main beams, creating the sloped roof structure. Her competence continued to impress Ethan, her knowledge of construction principles revealing the depth of her father's teaching. "Your father taught you well," he commented, as she correctly angled a rafter end without being shown. A sad smile crossed her features. He wanted a son to pass his knowledge to. Got me instead. Said if I couldn't be a boy, I'd at least be a girl who knew how to build something solid. Wise man, Ethan replied. Knowledge isn't worth less because of who carries it. Their eyes met briefly across the timbers between them, something unspoken passing in the exchange. Rebecca looked away first, returning to her work with heightened focus, but the moment lingered in the air between them, a recognition of shared values deeper than the day's labor. As sunset approached, they secured the last of the main roof beams, creating the skeleton of what would become the peaked roof. Standing back to assess their day's work, Ethan felt satisfaction in what they had accomplished. The room now stood defined in 3 dimensions, its walls square, its proportions pleasing to the eye. "We did it," William breathed, awe in his voice as he took in the structure. "We really raised the walls." "That we did," Ethan confirmed, allowing pride to color his tone. "Good work, all of you." Charlotte, who had alternated between watching their progress and playing in the snow nearby, approached the doorway with solemn importance. "May I go in again, Mr. Reed?" "It's your room, Charlotte," Ethan replied, then caught himself. "For now, at least. Mind the tools on the floor." The little girl entered carefully, her small figure framed by the doorway. Looking up at the roof beams now visible against the darkening sky, she gasped with childish wonder. "It's like a castle." Her innocent delight brought smiles to the adults' faces, the day's labor finding meaning in her simple joy. Even Ethan, unused to children's perspectives, found himself seeing the structure anew through her eyes, the rough-hewn timbers transformed into something magical by her imagination. They gathered their tools as darkness fell, the temperature dropping rapidly with the sun's departure. Tomorrow they would begin work on the roof proper, enclosing the structure against the elements. But for now, the room stood open to the star-filled sky, a work in progress much like the relationships forming between its builders. The following morning, Ethan was checking the stability of the wall framing when he heard the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. Straightening, he peered toward the road, recognition dawning as 3 riders came into view. Howard Sullivan rode in the lead, his expensive coat and polished saddle marking him as a man of means even at a distance. Behind him rode Harriet Crawford, bundled against the cold but unmistakable in her rigid posture. The third rider, to Ethan's surprise, was Reverend Michael Thompson, the young minister who had arrived in Oak Ridge just last year. "Visitors?" Ethan called toward the cabin where Rebecca was preparing breakfast. She appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from inquiry to wariness as she spotted the approaching riders. "Sullivan," she murmured, instinctively moving toward Charlotte, who had followed her outside. "And the Crawford woman," Ethan added grimly, with the Reverend, interestingly enough. William emerged from the barn where he had been tending the animals, moving to stand near his mother and sister. The family unconsciously formed a unit, drawing together in the face of potential threat. Ethan moved to position himself between the Mortons and the approaching riders, his stance relaxed but alert. 8 years of solitude had not erased the instincts formed in his younger days when he had occasionally served as deputy to the county sheriff during times of need. "Reed," Sullivan called as they approached, reining his horse to a stop at a respectful distance. "Fine morning." Sullivan, Ethan acknowledged with a nod. "Mrs. Crawford, Reverend, what brings you out this way?" Sullivan dismounted with practiced ease, handing his reins to Harriet, who remained seated, her sharp eyes taking in the cabin, the Mortons, and the partially constructed room with obvious disapproval. "Community concern, Reed," Sullivan replied, his tone carefully modulated between friendly and official. "As town clerk, certain matters are brought to my attention." "What matters would those be?" Ethan asked, his voice neutral, despite the tension building in his shoulders. Sullivan gestured toward the Mortons. Your guests. Their presence here has raised questions in town. Didn't realize my business was town concern, Ethan replied evenly. Harriet Crawford sniffed audibly. When it involves moral considerations, Mr. Reed, it becomes everyone's concern. A single man, a widow woman, children present. Surely you understand how this appears. Reverend Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, his young face troubled. Mr. Reed, please understand we come with genuine concern, not an accusation. The welfare of Mrs. Morton and her children is being well looked after, Ethan cut in firmly. As you can see, he gestured toward the new construction, building them proper quarters for the winter. Sullivan's gaze shifted to the framed room, his expression calculating. Very generous of you, though one might wonder about your motivations. The implication hung in the air, too clear to ignore. Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Rebecca stepped forward, her posture straight, her voice steady. Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Crawford, Reverend, she acknowledged. I appreciate your concern for our welfare, but I assure you it's unnecessary. Mr. Reed has been nothing but honorable. He offered shelter when we had nowhere else to go, and now he's building separate quarters to ensure propriety is maintained. Harriet's lips pursed in obvious disbelief. My dear, you may not fully understand the implications. I understand perfectly, Mrs. Crawford, Rebecca interrupted, her tone polite but firm. I also understand that Christian charity doesn't usually involve questioning the decency of those who practice it. The Reverend's face colored, whether from embarrassment at being implicated or admiration for Rebecca's composed defense was unclear. Sullivan, however, remained unperturbed, his smile never reaching his eyes. Of course, Mrs. Morton, no one questions Mr. Reed's generosity. Our concern is merely for appearances and for your future security. His gaze shifted to the children, then back to Rebecca. A widow with young ones needs more than temporary shelter. She needs respectable standing in a community, protection from gossip and speculation. Ethan recognized the strategy now, saw where Sullivan was leading. And I suppose you have a solution in mind, he said flatly. Sullivan spread his hands in a gesture of apparent openness. Several, actually. The boarding house in town has a vacant room, proper supervised accommodations for a lady and her children. Or perhaps, he paused, his expression shifting to calculated benevolence. A more permanent arrangement could be discussed. What arrangement? Rebecca asked warily. Marriage, my dear, Harriet interjected, leaning forward in her saddle. A respectable widow such as yourself shouldn't be living under these irregular circumstances. Mr. Sullivan is a man of means and position in Oak Ridge. He has generously indicated he would consider offering you his name and protection. The naked calculation of the offer hung in the air like the chill of the winter morning. Ethan felt something cold and hard form in his chest, a familiar anger he had not experienced in years. Rebecca's face drained of color, but her voice remained steady. That's unexpected, Mr. Sullivan. We've never even been properly introduced. A formality easily remedied, Sullivan replied smoothly. I've made inquiries about your circumstances. A woman in your position with your responsibilities, his gaze shifted meaningfully to William and Charlotte, should consider practical matters above romantic notions. The Reverend cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves. The immediate concern is the current living arrangement, which is temporary, Ethan cut in, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made even drunken cowboys reconsider their actions. Mrs. Morton and her children will occupy the new room once it's completed. Their presence here is above reproach, as any fair-minded person would acknowledge. Sullivan's smile thinned. Admirable intentions, Reed, but intentions don't silence wagging tongues. The damage to Mrs. Morton's reputation— My reputation is my concern, Mr. Sullivan, Rebecca interrupted, her patience visibly fraying, and I fail to see how marrying a man I barely know would protect it more effectively than the honest arrangement Mr. Reed has offered. Sullivan's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing back into practiced affability. Consider the children, Mrs. Morton, and what future do they have, attached to a temporary charity, a proper home, education, social standing? These are things I could provide that Reed simply cannot. Charlotte, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, suddenly pressed closer to her mother. I don't want to go, Mama, she whispered, loud enough for all to hear in the winter stillness. I like our new room. The simple declaration carried more weight than any adult argument. Rebecca placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder, her decision evident in the gesture. "Thank you for your concern, all of you," she said firmly, "but we are quite content with our current arrangement." Sullivan's mask of benevolence slipped further. "Content today doesn't ensure security tomorrow, Mrs. Morton. There are legal considerations regarding the welfare of children that the territorial court takes quite seriously." The threat, thinly veiled though it was, caused William to step forward, his young face set in determination. "You can't take us away. Mr. Reed promised to teach me carpentry. We're building our room together." Sullivan's gaze shifted to the boy, something calculating entering his expression. "Admirable skills to learn, young man, but a boy needs more than hammer and nails for his future. Education, opportunity, connections, these are the tools of true advancement." Ethan had heard enough. Moving forward, he positioned himself more directly between Sullivan and the Mortons. "Your concern is noted, Sullivan. If that's all, we've got work to continue." For a moment, tension stretched between the men, unspoken challenge passing between them. Then Sullivan nodded, his smile returning though his eyes remained cold. But as he turned to leave, Sullivan paused, his voice dropping to ensure only Ethan could hear. "I spoke with Judge Morrison last week about your property dispute. Interesting how quickly a territorial judge's opinion on land claims can shift when questions of moral character arise." He glanced meaningfully at Rebecca and the children. "Remember, Reed, I don't just file papers in Oak Ridge. I have friends in the county seat, too." Ethan's hand instinctively tightened into a fist, the urge to strike Sullivan rising hot in his chest. It took every ounce of restraint to keep his voice steady. "Threaten me all you want, Sullivan, but leave them out of it." Sullivan's eyes glittered with cold satisfaction at having found Ethan's vulnerable point. "I'm merely concerned for their welfare, as any upstanding citizen would be." He stepped back, raising his voice to its normal pitch. "Of course, don't let us keep you from your project. Of course, don't let us keep you from your project." He turned to Rebecca with a small bow. "Consider my offer, Mrs. Morton. The future of your children may depend on it." With that parting remark, he remounted his horse, nodding for the others to follow his lead. As they prepared to depart, Reverend Thompson hesitated, turning back to address Rebecca directly. "Mrs. Morton, please know the church is available to you and your children should you need any assistance. Sunday services, community suppers, you would be most welcome." The young minister's sincerity contrasted sharply with Sullivan's calculated interest. Rebecca nodded her acknowledgement. "Thank you, Reverend. That's very kind." As the three riders departed, Ethan watched them go, his mind working through the implications of this visit. Sullivan's interest was clearly not limited to Ethan's land, but now extended to the Mortons themselves, or more specifically, to using them as leverage. "He's not going to stop, is he?" Rebecca asked quietly, coming to stand beside him. Ethan shook his head. "Not his nature. Man sees what he wants, keeps changing tactics until he gets it." "And what does he want? Your land, or—" She left the question unfinished. "Both, I suspect," Ethan replied grimly. "Land first and foremost. You and the children are just new pieces in his game." They stood in silence, watching the riders disappear around the bend in the road. Finally, Ethan turned to Rebecca, his expression resolute. "Changes nothing about our plans. We finish this room, make it proper and solid. Meanwhile, I'll ride to the county seat, make sure my claim is secure." Rebecca studied his face, her own concern evident. "And if Sullivan tries to use the children as leverage?" He implied he could involve the territorial court. "Empty threat for now," Ethan assured her, though inwardly he was less certain. No grounds for court involvement with children well housed and cared for. William had moved to stand on Rebecca's other side, his young face troubled, but determined. "I won't go with him, Ma, not ever." Rebecca placed a gentle hand on her son's shoulder. "No one's going anywhere, William. Mr. Reed is right. We continue as planned." Charlotte, sensing the tension had passed, tugged at her mother's skirt. "Can we work on our room now? I want to help with the roof." The innocent question broke the lingering tension, drawing a genuine smile from Rebecca. "Yes, little one. Life continues. Roofs need building." They returned to their work with renewed purpose, the morning's confrontation lending urgency to their efforts. The room needed completion not merely for comfort now, but as visible evidence of the Mortons' secure situation should questions arise. As they positioned the roof rafters, Ethan found himself watching Rebecca more intently than before, struck by her composure during Sullivan's transparent manipulations. She had stood her ground with quiet dignity, neither angry nor intimidated, revealing a strength of character that commanded respect. "You handled Sullivan well," he commented as they worked side by side securing a rafter. "Most folks get flustered when he starts talking legal matters." Rebecca smiled faintly. "I've dealt with men like him before. Different clothes, same tactics. They count on intimidation, on making you feel smaller than you are." "And you don't feel small," Ethan observed. "Not anymore," she replied, her gaze steady. "There was a time when Frank made me believe I was nothing without him. Even at his worst, I believed that. His death forced me to discover otherwise." The simple statement revealed volumes about her journey, about the inner strength she had discovered through necessity. Ethan nodded, recognizing in her the same resilience he had forged in his own grief. "Sullivan underestimates you," he said. "Good. Gives us an advantage." "Us?" Rebecca questioned, the word hanging between them with unspoken significance. Ethan met her gaze directly. "You're under my roof. That makes your troubles mine, at least until spring." Something shifted in Rebecca's expression. Gratitude mingled with another emotion Ethan couldn't quite identify. She nodded once, accepting his declaration without further comment, and they returned to their work, the moment passing but not forgotten. By evening, the roof structure was nearly complete, the rafters forming a peaked outline against the darkening sky. Tomorrow they would add the sheathing, enclosing the room against the elements for the first time. Progress was swift, the work advancing more rapidly than Ethan had initially estimated, propelled by their shared purpose and growing skill as a team. After dinner, with the children settled in the barn loft, Ethan unfolded a map of the county on the table, showing Rebecca the boundaries of his claim. 160 acres under the Homestead Act, he explained, tracing the perimeter. 5 years residency and improvements required for full deed. Should have been settled 3 years ago, but survey dispute with federal land office has kept it in limbo. Rebecca studied the map, her expression thoughtful. "And where would this proposed railroad spur run?" Ethan indicated the eastern edge of his property. "Natural path follows the creek, cuts across this corner, makes the land valuable beyond its agricultural worth." Explaining Sullivan's interest, Rebecca concluded, "Railroad would pay well for right-of-way." Ethan nodded grimly. 10 times what the land's worth for farming. Sullivan's been trying to buy me out for years. Likely has arrangements with the railroad already, pending acquisition. And now he sees another avenue," Rebecca said softly. "Through us." The simple statement hung between them, acknowledgement of how their lives had become intertwined through circumstance. Ethan rolled up the map, his decision made. "I'll ride to the county seat day after tomorrow, once the roof is secured. Check the status of my claim. And make sure everything's properly recorded. Been putting it off too long." "Will it help?" Rebecca asked. "If the survey dispute remains unresolved?" Ethan shrugged. "Can't hurt to have the paperwork in order. Besides, might learn something useful about Sullivan's activities. Man like that leaves traces." Rebecca nodded, accepting his reasoning. "We'll continue work while you're gone. William and I can manage the simpler tasks." The casual assumption of continuing their shared project settled comfortably between them, neither acknowledging how natural such planning had become. 8 years of solitude had given way to cooperative effort with remarkable ease, as if Ethan's isolated existence had merely been an interruption in the natural order of things rather than his chosen path. As Rebecca prepared for bed, gathering her shawl to make the cold walk to the barn loft, she paused at the door. "Ethan," she said quietly, "thank you for standing with us today." He looked up from the fire, meeting her gaze across the room. "No need for thanks. Right is right." She smiled slightly at his simple moral calculus. "Nevertheless, it means something, knowing we're not facing Sullivan alone." After she had gone, Ethan remained by the fire, turning over the day's events in his mind. Sullivan's interest in the Mortons complicated matters significantly. Land disputes could be resolved through legal channels, property rights defended through documentation and testimony. But Sullivan's implied threat regarding the children introduced a new dimension, one that legal papers alone couldn't address. The territorial courts held broad discretion in matters concerning child welfare. A man of Sullivan's position could potentially influence such proceedings, especially if he could convince authorities that the children's current living arrangement was somehow improper or unstable. The thought of William and Charlotte being legally removed from Rebecca's care, perhaps placed with Sullivan himself as a respectable guardian, stirred a deep anger in Ethan's chest. He had seen such manipulations before, Powerful men using the law to achieve what force could not. Not this time, he murmured to the fire, determination hardening his resolve. Whatever Sullivan's game, Ethan would not allow the Mortons to become pawns in it. 8 years of avoiding entanglement had come to an end the moment he had invited them across his threshold. Now he would see that decision through, whatever it might cost. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the windows with increasing force. Another storm approaching, nature's reminder of winter's grip on the territory. Inside, Ethan added another log to the fire, the flames leaping higher as they consumed the fresh fuel. That night, after checking the barn one last time, Ethan paused at Eleanor's grave on the small rise behind the property. He hadn't visited in months, the pain still too raw despite the years past. "Things are changing, Ellie," he said quietly into the cold night air. "I think you'd approve." Returning to the cabin, he retrieved his grandfather's old ledger from the shelf, a record of family accounts dating back to when the Reeds first came west. On a fresh page, he wrote in careful script, "December 18th, 18, Morton family arrives, William, Charlotte, and Rebecca." Below it, he added, "Room construction begun, foundation laid, walls raised." Then after a moment's hesitation, he wrote, "Property claim to be secured, Sullivan problem to be addressed." It wasn't just a building record anymore. It was the beginning of a family history. From his desk drawer, Ethan pulled out the surveyor's map with the disputed boundary marked in red. For years, he'd accepted the unresolved status, having nothing worth fighting for beyond his solitary existence. Now, studying the creek line where Sullivan claimed the railroad would run, he began marking strategic positions, legal strongholds he would establish with Judge Harmon's help. On the table, he laid out 3 items: the property deed, his father's old pocket watch he'd stopped carrying after Eleanor's death, and a small leather pouch of seed corn saved from his first harvest. Land, time, future, all connected now in ways he hadn't allowed himself to consider for 8 long years. Outside, the wind continued to drive snow against the windows, but its howl no longer matched the emptiness inside him. The winter would be long, the challenges significant, but for the first time since he'd carved Eleanor and James's names into that doorframe, Ethan Reed was planning beyond mere survival. He'd promised to build a room. But in that simple act, he'd laid the foundation for something far more enduring. The room would shelter the Mortons through winter. His resolve would protect them from Sullivan, and perhaps, if he found the courage, his heart might shelter something even more precious when spring finally came.